Sometimes the person who changed your life the most is the one you never truly saw. Every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., Ethan Parker walked through the glass doors of Willow and Ash Cafe. The routine never changed. A medium dark roast, one packet of raw sugar, a seat by the front window overlooking Madison Avenue. Rain or sunshine, winter snow or summer heat. For nearly 2 years, it had been the same. And for nearly 2 years, Claire Bennett had been the one serving him. She always noticed him before he noticed her. The moment his black sedan pulled to the curb, she would already be reaching for his favorite ceramic mug. The coffee would be ready before he reached the counter. No questions, no mistakes, no unnecessary conversation. Just quiet efficiency. Most customers appreciated that. Ethan rarely seemed to notice. At 38 years old, Ethan Parker was the founder and CEO of Parker Technologies, one of the fastest-growing software companies in the country. His face appeared regularly on business magazines. His interviews reached millions of viewers. Investors followed his every move. Yet every morning he sat alone, staring through the cafe window as if the entire city existed somewhere beyond his reach. Claire never asked why. She simply served the coffee and returned to work. On a chilly October morning, the sky hung low over Manhattan. Gray clouds drifted between the skyscrapers, turning the city silver. Inside the cafe, warm light reflected across polished wood tables. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Ethan arrived right on time. Claire placed his cup on the counter before he even reached it. "Good morning, Mr. Parker," she said quietly. "Morning, Claire." It was one of the few times he actually said her name. Claire offered a polite smile. Nothing more. Ethan collected his coffee and headed toward his usual table. Halfway across the room, his phone vibrated. He glanced down at the screen. At the same moment, the leather wallet tucked beneath his arm slipped free. It landed on the hardwood floor with a soft thud. Ethan never noticed. Claire did. She stepped from behind the counter and walked toward the fallen wallet. "Mr. Parker," she called. But he was already focused on the phone conversation. Claire bent down and picked up the wallet. The leather felt worn despite its luxury brand. As she turned it over, something inside shifted. A photograph partially slid from one of the inner compartments. Claire froze. Her fingers stopped moving. The color drained from her face. The cafe seemed to disappear around her. The conversations faded. The music vanished. Even the smell of coffee felt distant. Her eyes remained locked on the photograph. It showed a younger man standing beside a damaged vehicle on a rain-soaked roadside. Emergency lights glowed in the background. The image was old, nearly faded, but she recognized it immediately. She recognized the face. She recognized the night. Most of all, she recognized the reason that photograph existed at all. 7 years earlier, during a storm she had spent years trying to forget, one decision had changed 2 lives forever. Claire slowly looked up. Across the cafe, Ethan sat alone by the window. He stared outside, completely unaware. Unaware that the woman serving his coffee every morning was carrying a secret connected directly to him. Unaware that she had recognized him the very first day he walked through those doors. And completely unaware that, 7 years ago, on the worst night of his life, Claire Bennett had already met him once before. Claire carefully slid the photograph back into the wallet and closed it before anyone could notice the change in her expression. Her hands remained steady. Years of practice had taught her that when life took something away, you learned how to hide the tremor before it reached your fingers. She crossed the cafe and placed the wallet beside Ethan's cup. "You dropped this," she said softly. Ethan glanced up from his phone. "Thank you." His voice was distracted. He barely looked at her before returning to the screen. Claire nodded and walked away. Yet for the rest of the morning, she found herself stealing brief glances toward the window table. The same question echoed through her mind. Why was he still carrying that photograph? Most people moved on. Most people forgot. But not Ethan Parker. The answer arrived later that afternoon. Around 2 o'clock, the lunch crowd faded. The espresso machines quieted. Sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting long golden beams across the empty tables. Claire was wiping down the counter when Olivia, another waitress, appeared beside her. "Your favorite billionaire was here longer than usual today," Olivia teased. Claire smiled politely. "He is not my favorite anything." Olivia laughed. "Sure he is. The man tips well enough to pay my electric bill every month." Claire shook her head. He is just a customer. A customer who looks like he belongs on a magazine cover. Claire rolled her eyes and returned to cleaning. Olivia eventually wandered off toward the kitchen. The smile disappeared from Claire's face. Just a customer. That was exactly what she wanted him to remain. Nothing more. Nothing less. She glanced through the front window toward the busy Manhattan street outside. Taxis moved through traffic. People hurried along the sidewalks carrying briefcases and shopping bags. Everyone seemed to be rushing somewhere. Claire understood that feeling. For years she had been running from memories she could never quite leave behind. At 29, her life looked simple from the outside. Small apartment, long shifts, quiet evenings, a routine as predictable as the sunrise. But there had been another version of Claire Bennett once. A version with different plans, different dreams. 7 years earlier, she had been studying medicine. Her professors believed she had a brilliant future ahead of her. She believed it too. Then one stormy night changed everything. She rarely allowed herself to think about those years anymore. The memories lived inside carefully sealed boxes she never opened. Yet seeing that photograph had cracked one open. The sound of the front door pulled her back to the present. A delivery driver entered carrying supplies for the cafe. Claire signed the invoice and returned to work. But the memories continued pressing against the edges of her mind. Later that evening, after her shift ended, she stepped outside. The air carried the crisp chill of autumn. She wrapped her coat tighter and began the 12-block walk home. The city glowed around her. Neon signs reflected in puddles left by the morning rain. Traffic lights painted red and yellow streaks across wet pavement. As she passed a bookstore window, her phone buzzed. A message from her younger brother appeared on the screen. Just checking in. Hope you are not working too hard. Claire smiled. Her brother always worried about her. She typed back a quick reply and continued walking. Across town, several floors above the city, Ethan Parker stood inside his office overlooking Manhattan. His workday should have been over. Instead, he was staring at the same photograph that had slipped from his wallet that morning. His thumb brushed the worn edges of the picture. 7 years had passed. Hundreds of interviews. Thousands of meetings. Countless successes. Yet one unanswered question still followed him everywhere. Who was the woman who disappeared before he ever had the chance to thank her? The next morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight and cold air. Manhattan was already awake. Delivery trucks rumbled through narrow streets. Coffee carts released clouds of steam into the crisp October morning. Inside Willow and Ash Cafe, Claire Bennett was arranging fresh pastries in the display case when the front door opened. She did not need to look up. She already knew who it was. Ethan Parker stepped inside exactly at 7:15 a.m., as always. Dark overcoat, leather briefcase. The same calm expression that revealed almost nothing. Routine had become its own kind of language between them. Claire prepared his coffee before he reached the counter. Medium dark roast. 1 packet of raw sugar. Ceramic mug. Nothing changed. Yet this morning felt different. Because now she knew he was still searching. Ethan accepted the coffee with a brief nod. Thank you, Claire. Again, he used her name. A small thing. Most people would not notice. Claire did. She always noticed. Ethan carried the mug toward his usual seat by the window. As he passed, something caught Claire's attention. The photograph was no longer hidden inside his wallet. It sat partially visible inside a transparent sleeve attached to a notebook he carried beneath his arm. He wanted to see it often. That much was obvious. Claire lowered her eyes and returned to work. A few minutes later, a familiar voice interrupted the quiet rhythm of the cafe. Mr. Parker, I thought I might find you here. Claire glanced up. A man in his early 40s approached Ethan's table. Well-dressed, confident, friendly. Ethan stood and shook his hand. Daniel. They sat together. Claire tried not to listen, but the cafe was nearly empty. Voices traveled easily through the room. The board meeting starts at 9, Daniel said. You should probably stop hiding in coffee shops before then. Ethan smiled faintly. This place has better coffee than the office. Daniel laughed. That is not why you keep coming here. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked toward the window. For a brief second, Claire wondered if he might glance her way. He did not. You are still thinking about her, Daniel said quietly. The smile vanished from Ethan's face. Claire froze while wiping a nearby table. Daniel continued speaking. 7 years is a long time. Ethan stared at his coffee. Not long enough. Daniel sighed. You never even saw her face. No. You do not know her name. No. Then how are you still searching? Ethan's answer came softly, almost too softly to hear, because every day after that night was borrowed time. Silence settled between them. Daniel leaned back in his chair. You built an entire company. I know. You employ thousands of people. I know. You changed a lot of lives. Ethan looked down at the photograph visible beside his notebook. Because someone changed mine first. Claire's grip tightened around the cleaning cloth in her hand. She turned away before either man could notice. Her heart felt strangely heavy, not because of what Ethan said, but because she believed him. Most people thanked fate when good things happened. Most people thanked luck. Ethan Parker had spent 7 years thanking a stranger. Outside, sunlight reflected from nearby skyscrapers. Inside the cafe, the quiet conversation continued. Claire moved from table to table, pretending not to hear, pretending not to remember, pretending that 7 years ago she had not stood in the middle of a storm watching flashing emergency lights paint the rain-soaked road silver. But memories had a way of returning when least expected. And as Ethan sat by the window holding on to a photograph from the past, Claire realized something she had spent years avoiding. The distance between them was becoming harder to maintain. That evening, rain returned to the city. Not a storm, just a steady drizzle that painted the streets in silver reflections and softened the glow of every traffic light. Claire stood by the window of her small apartment, a mug of tea warming her hands. 12 floors below, umbrellas drifted along the sidewalks like dark moving shadows. Normally, the view calmed her. Tonight, it only pulled her deeper into memory. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. Because someone changed mine first. Claire closed her eyes. 7 years earlier, she would have laughed if anyone had told her that a single night could follow her for the rest of her life. Back then she had been 22. Ambitious. Determined. The kind of student who arrived early and stayed late. Her professors spoke about residency programs. Her classmates spoke about future careers. Claire spoke about helping people. It sounded simple then. Life often did before it became complicated. The next morning arrived gray and cool. Willow and Ash Cafe filled quickly with commuters escaping the weather. Claire moved through the familiar rhythm of orders and conversations. Fresh coffee, blueberry muffins, breakfast sandwiches, the usual rush. By 7:15 a.m., Ethan Parker stepped through the door once again. Something felt different immediately. He looked tired, not physically exhausted. Something deeper, like a man carrying thoughts that refused to leave him alone. Claire prepared his coffee without being asked. As she placed the mug on the counter, Ethan surprised her. Do you ever believe in coincidences? Claire looked up. The question seemed to appear from nowhere. Sometimes, she answered carefully. Ethan studied the steam rising from the coffee. I used to think everything happened for a reason. His voice was quiet. Now I am not so sure. Claire searched for a safe response. Maybe some things do. Maybe some things do not. A faint smile appeared on Ethan's face. That sounds like something my grandmother used to say. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan picked up his mug and headed toward his table. Yet the conversation lingered with Claire long after he walked away. Around 8 o'clock, Ethan received a phone call. He answered immediately. Claire was delivering pastries nearby when she heard part of the conversation. No, Ethan said. Run the search again. Silence. Then another pause. His expression hardened slightly. Expand the radius. Check neighboring counties if you have to. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. She already knew what the call was about. The search. After all these years, he was still searching. Ethan ended the call and stared out the window. His coffee sat untouched. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, Claire watched from a distance. Not because she wanted answers. She already had them. The difficult part was knowing that Ethan did not. For 7 years, he had been chasing a ghost. For 2 years, he had been sitting 20 feet away from the person he was looking for. And somehow, despite all his resources, all his investigators, all his determination, he had never once realized the truth was quietly serving him coffee every single morning. 3 days passed. The city settled into its usual rhythm. Morning commuters filled the sidewalks. Taxi horns echoed between buildings. Steam drifted from street grates into the cool autumn air. Yet something had shifted. Ethan Parker no longer seemed content to simply sit by the window and drink his coffee. Claire noticed it immediately. He lingered longer, asked more questions, watched the room instead of his phone. On Friday morning, He arrived 10 minutes earlier than usual. Claire was arranging fresh croissants when the door opened. Ethan stepped inside carrying a folded umbrella. Tiny drops of rain clung to his coat. "You are early today," Claire said before she could stop herself. Ethan smiled. "I guess I am." For a brief second, both seemed surprised by the exchange. Claire quickly returned to preparing his order. Ethan remained at the counter instead of heading toward his usual table. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. Claire handed him the coffee. "About 2 years." "Do you enjoy it?" The question felt genuine. Not polite conversation. Genuine curiosity. Claire considered the answer. "Most days." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Most days" sounds honest. A customer entered behind him. The moment ended. Ethan finally moved toward the window table. Yet throughout the morning, Claire caught him looking around the cafe more often than usual. Not at customers. Not at his phone. At details. The old brick walls. The framed photographs. The people who worked there every day. It was as if he had suddenly started paying attention to things he once overlooked. Later that afternoon, Ethan's assistant arrived unexpectedly. Her name was Rachel. Efficient. Organized. Always moving with purpose. She found Ethan seated at his usual table during a late meeting break. Claire delivered fresh coffee and stepped away. But fragments of their conversation drifted across the quiet room. "The investigator sent another report," Rachel said. Ethan looked up immediately. "Anything new?" Rachel hesitated. "Not really." The same conclusion. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Disappointment crossed his face. "No records. No witnesses. Nothing useful." Rachel lowered her voice. "You have been searching for 7 years." Ethan stared at the rain sliding down the window. "I know. Maybe she does not want to be found." Ethan remained silent. The possibility clearly hurt more than he wanted to admit. Rachel continued carefully. "Some people help because it is simply who they are." Ethan looked down at the photograph resting beside his notebook. "Then she deserves a thank you." Across the room, Claire stopped briefly while organizing cups behind the counter. Her eyes lowered. She understood something Ethan never did. Gratitude can be a beautiful thing, but sometimes it becomes a weight. 7 years ago, she had never expected recognition. She had never expected reward. She had only done what felt right in a moment when someone needed help. Yet hearing Ethan continue the search after all this time stirred something unexpected inside her. Not pride, not regret, something more complicated. Because for the first time, Claire began wondering what would happen if the truth ever surfaced. What would happen if Ethan finally discovered that the answer he had been chasing across 7 years, countless reports, and endless unanswered questions had been standing in front of him every single morning, holding a cup of coffee. The following Tuesday, the first real cold front of the season swept through Manhattan. Wind curled around the corners of buildings and sent fallen leaves skittering across the sidewalks. Inside Willow and Ash Cafe, warmth and conversation filled the air. Claire arrived before sunrise as she always did. She unlocked the side entrance, tied on her apron, and began preparing for the morning rush. The familiar routine usually quieted her thoughts. Not today. Ever since Ethan's conversation with Rachel, a feeling she could not quite name had followed her everywhere. At 7:15 a.m., the front door opened. Ethan stepped inside carrying a folder instead of his usual briefcase. His expression looked distracted. He nodded toward Claire. "Good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Parker." She handed him his coffee. Their fingers almost brushed. Claire quickly pulled her hand back and turned toward the espresso machine. Ethan hesitated before walking away. For a moment, it seemed as if he wanted to say something else. Then he continued toward the window table. The morning passed steadily. Customers came and went. Orders filled the counter. Outside, clouds gathered overhead. Around 10 o'clock, Ethan stood to leave. As he collected his things, a single sheet of paper slipped from the folder and drifted silently to the floor. Once again, he did not notice. Claire did. After he exited the cafe, she walked over and picked it up. Her breath caught immediately. It was not a business document. It was a copy of an old newspaper article. The headline described the highway accident from 7 years earlier. Beneath it was a photograph of the roadside taken after emergency crews arrived. Claire stared at the image. Rain. Flashing lights. Wet pavement. Memories she had spent years burying rose instantly to the surface. Then her eyes moved lower. Someone had written notes in the margins. Dates. Locations. Names. Questions. Years of investigation compressed onto a single page. At the bottom, one sentence was circled several times in black ink. Unknown female witness left scene before identification. Claire slowly lowered the paper. The cafe around her seemed strangely distant. Ethan had not simply searched. He had documented every lead, every possibility, every dead end. For 7 years. Claire folded the page carefully and slipped it back into the folder before he could return. Yet one detail remained trapped in her mind. Unknown female witness. She almost laughed at the phrase. There was something ironic about it. For years, Ethan had searched for an unknown woman. For years, Claire had worked hard to become invisible. Perhaps they had both succeeded too well. That evening, after the cafe closed, Claire lingered longer than usual. She wiped tables that were already clean, organized supplies that did not need organizing, anything to delay going home alone with her thoughts. Outside, darkness settled across the city. Finally, she switched off the last light and stepped onto the sidewalk. As she turned the corner, she never noticed the black sedan parked half a block away. Inside, Ethan Parker sat quietly behind the wheel. He was not following her. Not intentionally. He had simply recognized something familiar when he saw her holding the folder earlier that morning. Something about the way she looked at that newspaper article. Something about the expression that crossed her face. For the first time in 7 years, a small and unexpected question entered his mind. What if the answer had been closer than he ever imagined? The next morning, Ethan arrived 5 minutes later than usual. To anyone else, the difference would have meant nothing. To Claire, it felt noticeable. She had spent 2 years observing small details without meaning to. The way he loosened his tie after difficult meetings. The way he stared out the window when something weighed on his mind. The way he always carried that photograph close by. Today, there was something else. Uncertainty. Ethan accepted his coffee and paused at the counter. "Can I ask you something?" Claire felt her pulse quicken. "Of course." Ethan glanced toward the nearly empty cafe. "Have you lived in New York your whole life?" The question seemed simple enough. Yet Claire immediately understood it was not random. "Most of it," she answered carefully. Ethan nodded. "What about 7 years ago?" Claire forced herself to remain calm. "I was in New York then too." A strange silence followed. Ethan appeared to consider something before finally moving toward his usual table. Throughout the morning, he seemed distracted. More than once, Claire noticed him looking in her direction, only to quickly look away when she caught him. Around 9 o'clock, Rachel arrived carrying a tablet and several folders. She joined Ethan at the window. Their conversation remained quiet, but Claire could see the concern on Rachel's face. At one point, Ethan handed her the newspaper article. Rachel studied it before shaking her head. Then Ethan said something that made her sit up straighter. Rachel turned and briefly glanced toward the counter where Claire stood preparing drinks. It lasted less than a second. Yet Claire noticed. So did Ethan. Later, after Rachel left, Ethan remained alone. His coffee had gone cold. The rain outside had returned, tapping gently against the glass. Finally, he stood and approached the counter. Claire looked up. "Would you like a refill?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. "Actually, there is something I have always wondered." Claire waited. Ethan reached into his notebook and carefully removed the worn photograph. He placed it on the counter between them. For the first time, Claire saw it up close. The edges were frayed. The colors faded. Years of handling had left their mark. Yet Ethan treated it like something priceless. "Do you ever look at a photograph and feel like it is holding part of your life hostage?" he asked quietly. Claire's throat tightened. "Maybe." Ethan looked down at the picture. "This image has followed me for 7 years." His voice softened. "Everyone tells me to let it go." Claire studied the photograph without touching it. "And can you?" Ethan smiled sadly. "No." Another silence settled between them. Then Claire said something she immediately wished she could take back. "Maybe some answers arrive when people stop chasing them." Ethan looked up sharply. For a moment, neither moved. Neither spoke. Something flickered across his face. Recognition. Not of her identity. Not yet. But recognition of the feeling behind her words. As if she somehow understood a search that no one else could understand. Ethan slowly picked up the photograph. "That is exactly what my investigators said yesterday." Claire lowered her eyes. The distance between them was shrinking. Not because either wanted it to. Because the truth had begun finding its own path. The weekend arrived with clear skies for the first time in days. Sunlight spilled across Manhattan, turning glass towers into mirrors of gold and blue. Inside Willow and Ash Cafe, the mood felt lighter. Customers lingered longer. Conversations carried a little more laughter. Yet neither Claire nor Ethan seemed to notice. Both were distracted by thoughts they could not quite explain. Ethan arrived shortly after sunrise. He carried no notebook today, no folder, no photograph, at least not visibly. Claire prepared his coffee and placed it on the counter. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Claire." His voice sounded thoughtful, almost cautious. He remained standing instead of walking away. "Can I ask you another question?" Claire forced a smile. "You seem to have a lot of them lately." Ethan laughed softly. "That is probably true." For a moment, he looked around the cafe before speaking. "Do you believe people can disappear on purpose?" Claire felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Ethan folded his hands around the warm mug. "Someone does something important, something that changes a life. Then they leave without waiting for recognition." Claire looked down at the polished countertop. "Some people are not looking for recognition." Ethan nodded slowly. "I used to think that was impossible." "Why?" she asked. "Because if I changed someone's life, I would want to know what happened afterward." Claire met his eyes for the first time that morning. Maybe they already know enough. Something in her answers seemed to affect him. He stood quietly for several seconds before finally carrying his coffee to the window table. Throughout the day, Ethan worked from the cafe instead of his office. It was not unusual anymore. What was unusual was how often his attention drifted toward Claire. Not because of suspicion, not yet. More because she continued saying things that felt strangely familiar. Later that afternoon, a young college student entered the cafe carrying a stack of textbooks. The student recognized Ethan immediately and nervously approached his table. Claire watched from a distance. "Mr. Parker," the student said, "I just wanted to thank you." Ethan looked surprised. "For what?" "The Scholarship Foundation." The student smiled. "Without it, I would have had to leave school." Ethan's expression softened. "I am glad it helped." The student thanked him again before leaving. Claire noticed something then. Ethan remained staring at the door long after the student disappeared, as if the encounter had awakened another memory. When the cafe finally quieted, Ethan approached the counter one last time before leaving. "You know something strange?" he said. Claire looked up. "What?" Ethan smiled faintly. "For years I thought finding answers would make everything easier." He glanced toward the window where sunlight stretched across the floor. "Lately I am starting to think understanding people matters more than understanding events." Claire felt her breath catch. Ethan nodded politely and headed for the door. The bell chimed overhead as he stepped outside. Claire watched him disappear into the crowd. Then she looked down at the coffee cup he had left behind. Written on a napkin beneath, it was a single sentence. Not a note for her. Not intentionally. Perhaps simply a reminder to himself. Yet she read it anyway. "Sometimes the people we search for are hiding in plain sight." Claire stared at the words for a long moment. Outside, the city continued moving. Inside, something invisible had shifted once again. Monday morning arrived with a sharp blue sky and the kind of cold that made people walk faster. Claire reached the cafe before dawn. The streets were still quiet. Storefront lights reflected across empty sidewalks. For a few precious minutes, the city belonged only to delivery drivers, early commuters, and people carrying private worries. Claire unlocked the front door and stepped inside. She expected an ordinary day. Instead, she found a small envelope resting on the counter. No stamp, no address, just her first name written neatly across the front. Claire. Her stomach tightened. Almost no one knew where she worked outside her family and close friends. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a photocopy of the old newspaper article, the same article Ethan had been carrying. Her pulse quickened. Attached to it was a handwritten note. "Have you ever seen this before?" There was no signature. None was necessary. Claire immediately recognized the handwriting. "Ethan." She stood motionless for several seconds. The cafe around her felt strangely silent. This was no longer coincidence. Ethan had begun asking questions. Real questions. Questions that pointed directly toward her. Throughout the morning, Claire found herself glancing at the clock. At exactly 7:15 a.m., the front door opened. Ethan stepped inside as always. Yet this time, there was something different in his eyes. Not certainty. Curiosity. The kind that grows when small pieces begin fitting together. Claire prepared his coffee. Their usual routine unfolded exactly as it had hundreds of times before. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Ethan accepted the mug and paused. Did you find something on the counter this morning? Claire met his gaze. Maybe. Ethan smiled faintly. And Claire chose her words carefully. Maybe whoever received it has not decided whether to answer yet. Ethan nodded slowly. Neither looked away. For the first time since they had met, the silence between them felt crowded with meaning. Later that afternoon, Rachel arrived carrying several folders. She sat across from Ethan near the window. Claire tried not to listen. She failed almost immediately. I checked the university records, Rachel said quietly. There was one thing that stood out. Ethan leaned forward. What? Rachel opened a file. A medical student withdrew from the program shortly after the accident. Claire froze while organizing cups behind the counter. And Ethan asked. Rachel looked down at the paperwork. The timeline matches. Ethan remained silent. Rachel continued. There is probably nothing there. Thousands of students leave school every year. Yet neither sounded convinced. Claire felt her heartbeat echo in her ears. The distance she had carefully maintained for 7 years was beginning to disappear. Not because she had made a mistake, because the truth was finally running out of places to hide. As evening approached, Ethan prepared to leave. Before stepping through the door, he turned back toward the counter. His voice remained calm. Claire. She looked up. Yes. Ethan hesitated. Just for a moment. Sometimes answers arrive when people stop chasing them. Claire immediately recognized the words. They were hers. Ethan smiled softly and walked out into the fading light. Claire watched the door close behind him. Then she lowered her eyes toward the folded newspaper article hidden beneath the counter. For years she had believed the past belonged behind her. Now it felt as if it was slowly walking back into her life, one careful step at a time. The following morning, Claire arrived carrying a decision she had not yet admitted to herself. The folded newspaper article remained inside her bag. She had read it 3 times the night before. Not because it contained new information, because it reminded her how much time had passed. 7 years. 7 years of silence. 7 years of believing that chapter of her life had ended. Yet every day, Ethan seemed to move one step closer to the truth. At exactly 7:15 a.m., the cafe door opened. Ethan entered as always. But this morning he was not alone. Rachel followed him inside, carrying a thin file folder. They took their usual table by the window. Claire delivered the coffee and stepped away. She told herself she would not listen. Then she heard her own name. Claire Bennett, Rachel said quietly. Ethan looked down at the folder. What about her? Claire felt her heart stop for a fraction of a second. She continued arranging cups without turning around. Rachel opened the file. I did not ask for this search. It appeared while cross-checking old records. Ethan remained silent. Rachel continued. She attended Columbia Medical School. Ethan looked up immediately. Medical school? Rachel nodded. She withdrew 7 years ago. Neither spoke for several seconds. Outside, traffic moved through the city. Inside, the cafe suddenly felt very small. Ethan finally broke the silence. The same year as the accident. Rachel nodded again. Yes. Claire focused on a stack of saucers in front of her. 1, 2, 3. Anything to keep her hands steady. Rachel lowered her voice further. There is more. Ethan leaned forward. Go on. Several professors described her as exceptional. Rachel turned a page. Top of her class. Strong clinical evaluations. Multiple scholarship offers. Ethan frowned. Then why leave? Rachel closed the folder. There is no explanation in the records. The question lingered in the air. Claire already knew the answer. She remembered hospital hallways, missed semesters, financial pressures, difficult choices. She remembered watching one future slowly disappear while trying not to regret the decision. Yet she had never blamed anyone, especially not Ethan. Across the room, Ethan stared at the folder. Something was beginning to connect inside his mind. Not evidence, not proof, a pattern, a feeling. The same feeling that had followed him ever since Claire first looked at that photograph. Around noon, Rachel left for another meeting. Ethan remained behind. The lunch crowd filled the cafe. Claire hoped the noise would create distance between them. Instead, Ethan approached the counter. He held the file in one hand. Can I ask you something personal? Claire hesitated. Maybe. Ethan looked directly at her. Do you ever wonder how different your life would be if one day had gone differently? Claire felt the question settle between them. She knew he was not really asking about careers or choices. He was asking about fate, about moments that divide a life into before and after. Claire answered honestly. Sometimes. Ethan nodded slowly. Me too. Neither moved. Neither looked away. For the first time, Claire realized something important. Ethan was no longer searching for a stranger. Without realizing it, he had already started searching for her. The next day began quietly. A thin layer of fog drifted between the buildings, softening the edges of the city. Claire arrived early, hoping the extra time would settle her thoughts. It did not. Every conversation with Ethan seemed to bring the truth closer to the surface. Every question felt heavier than the one before. By 7:15 a.m., he walked through the door carrying only his coffee cup from the day before. Claire noticed immediately. Ethan set it gently on the counter. I forgot to leave this yesterday. Claire smiled faintly. Most people would have taken a new one. Most people are not attached to routines. His answer sounded simple, but something in his voice suggested a deeper meaning. Claire handed him a fresh coffee. Ethan remained standing. Can I tell you something strange? Claire nodded. Ethan looked toward the window before speaking. For years I thought I was searching for a single moment. He paused. Now I think I was really searching for a person. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. Did you find them? Ethan smiled sadly. Not yet. Then he carried his coffee to the usual table. The morning moved slowly. Outside, the fog lifted. Sunlight returned. Inside the cafe, customers filled the room with familiar sounds. Yet Claire found herself distracted. Around 10 o'clock, her phone vibrated. A message from her younger brother appeared on the screen. Thinking about you. Do not carry everything alone. Claire stared at the words. Her brother had always known when something troubled her. Even from miles away. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and returned to work. A few minutes later, Ethan received a visitor. Not Rachel this time. An older man entered the cafe wearing a navy overcoat and silver-framed glasses. He greeted Ethan warmly and joined him at the table. Claire delivered fresh coffee and stepped away. The man's voice carried farther than he realized. You are still chasing that story? He asked. Ethan nodded. Yes. The older man laughed softly. 7 years. That is commitment. Ethan looked down at the photograph resting beside his cup. Some debts deserve commitment. The man studied him carefully. What if she never wanted recognition? Ethan was silent for several seconds. Then he answered, I would respect that. He looked toward the front window. But I would still want her to know something. What? The man asked. Ethan smiled. That her choice mattered. Claire stopped walking for the briefest moment. Her eyes lowered. Of all the possibilities she had imagined, she had never expected that answer. Not money. Not rewards. Not obligation. Just acknowledgement. The older man eventually left. The lunch crowd arrived. Hours passed. Yet Ethan's words remained with Claire. That her choice mattered. For years she had convinced herself the past belonged in the past. For years she believed disappearing had been the correct decision. But now, for the first time, she wondered if silence had protected only herself. And as the afternoon sun stretched across the cafe floor, Claire realized she was no longer afraid of being found. She was afraid of what would happen when Ethan finally learned the entire truth. The revelation arrived on a Thursday morning. Not with drama, not with certainty, just one small detail that refused to be ignored. Ethan entered the cafe carrying a thin envelope. His expression was calm, but Claire could see the tension behind it. He took his usual seat by the window. Minutes later, Rachel arrived and placed another file on the table. Claire tried to focus on work. She failed. Across the room, Ethan opened the envelope and removed a photocopy of an old hospital intake form. Rachel pointed toward a section near the bottom. Ethan read it once. Then again. His face changed. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly. What is it? Rachel asked. Ethan did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the page. Finally, he spoke. The witness who helped that night signed only her initials. Rachel nodded. That is what every report says. Ethan looked up. No, not every report. He turned the paper toward her. One document survived the archive transfer. Rachel leaned closer. Her eyes widened. On the form were 2 initials written in blue ink. C.B. Silence followed. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. Rachel stared at the page. That could be anyone. Ethan nodded. It could, yet neither sounded convinced. Rachel slowly opened another file. Claire Bennett. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. The pieces were finally connecting. Medical student. Same year. Same city. Same initials. Same reaction to the photograph. The same strange understanding every time they spoke about the past. Across the cafe, Claire continued serving customers. Coffee, pastries, smiles, routine. Yet inside, everything felt different. A few minutes later, Ethan stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically. He simply crossed the room, carrying the old photograph in one hand. Claire looked up as he approached. For a moment, neither spoke. The noise of the cafe seemed to fade into the background. Ethan placed the photograph on the counter. I have asked myself one question for 7 years, he said quietly. Claire remained still. Ethan looked directly into her eyes. Why did she leave before anyone could thank her? Claire lowered her gaze toward the faded image. Memories returned all at once. Rain, flashing lights, a frightened young medical student making a decision and never expecting to hear about it again. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. Because gratitude was never the reason. Ethan's expression softened. Something inside him already knew the answer before the words arrived. It was you, wasn't it? The question hung between them. Claire could have denied it. For years, she always had. But some truths eventually become too heavy to carry alone. She looked at him and gave the smallest nod. Nothing more. Ethan stared at her in silence. Not shock, not disbelief, just understanding. 7 years of searching ended with a simple gesture from a woman standing behind a coffee counter. And somehow, that felt exactly right. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The morning sunlight spilled through the cafe windows, casting warm reflections across the polished floor. Customers continued their conversations. Cups clinked softly against saucers. The city moved forward exactly as it always had. Yet for Ethan Parker, time seemed to stand still. 7 years of questions had ended with a single nod. Claire looked down at the counter, almost embarrassed by the attention. Ethan understood why. The woman standing before him had never wanted recognition. She had never wanted praise. She had simply done what she believed was right and quietly continued living her life. Why did you never tell me? He finally asked. Claire smiled gently. Because you already had your life back. Ethan lowered his eyes. Those words stayed with him. So simple, so honest. Claire continued. The day I helped you was important to you. But to me, it was just a moment when someone needed help. Ethan shook his head softly. It was much more than that. For the first time, Claire allowed herself to hear the full truth. Ethan told her about the years that followed. About building his company. About creating scholarships for students who needed a chance. About the employees whose families depended on opportunities his company provided. About his younger sister, who had overcome a difficult illness and now worked as a teacher. Every story led back to the same point. A future that almost never happened. Claire listened quietly. Not with pride. Not with regret. Just gratitude that life had unfolded the way it did. Then Ethan learned something he never expected. He learned what happened to Claire afterward. How she left medical school. How financial challenges forced difficult choices. How she rebuilt her life one step at a time without complaining. Without bitterness. Without ever blaming anyone. Ethan sat in silence after hearing it. Finally, he said something that surprised even himself. You spent years believing that day changed my life. Claire looked at him. Ethan smiled. Maybe it changed yours too. Just in a different way. Tears gathered in Claire's eyes, but she laughed softly. Maybe. In the weeks that followed, nothing dramatic happened. There were no headlines. No press conferences. No grand announcements. That was not who Claire was. She continued working at Willow and Ash Cafe. She continued greeting customers with the same kindness she always had. Ethan continued stopping by every morning at 7:15. The same coffee. The same window seat. The same quiet conversations. Yet something had changed. The mystery was gone. In its place stood something better. Understanding. Respect. Friendship. One cold December morning, Ethan arrived carrying a small framed photograph. He handed it to Claire. It was not the old accident picture. It was a new one. The cafe. The morning sunlight. A simple moment frozen in time. On the back, he had written a single sentence. Some people save a life once. Others keep inspiring it every day. Claire smiled as she read it. Outside, snow began falling across Manhattan. Inside, warmth filled the room. And perhaps that was the real ending. Not that Ethan finally found the person he had been searching for, but that he discovered she had never been extraordinary because of one moment. She was extraordinary because of the quiet dignity she carried every day afterward. Sometimes the people who change our lives never ask to be remembered. Yet somehow, they leave footprints on our hearts that time can never erase. And if this story reminded you of someone whose kindness changed your own life, perhaps take a moment to share that memory below. Stories like these deserve to be remembered. And if you would like to hear more journeys about quiet courage, unexpected grace, and the people who make the world better without asking for recognition, you are always welcome to join us again.